Hey, everybody, before we start the show, I wanted to let you know that there is going to be a new podcast on Dspn. It is an actual play podcast that I will be GMing. You might remember when John Four and I talked about the Demon Plague, our Kickstarter, on this very podcast. Well, that is going to be coming to you soon, and in order to entice you to buy it and also just to have a bunch of fun with awesome friends, we are doing an actual play. So it's going to be live streamed on our Twitch channel at twitch.tv/don'tsplitthepodcast. We will also post those episodes to YouTube. And right now you can subscribe to a podcast feed for The Demon Plague. All of this is detailed over at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com. Check it out. Go subscribe to Twitch, to our YouTube, or to the podcast on the podcatcher app of your choice. And please check it out. There's going to be a lot of great players. Rudy Basso is one of the players. Lauren Urban is one of the players. TK Johnson is one of the players, and Robert Aducci. There will also be some guest stars. It is going to be a great time. Go check it out. This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. Today on the show, I have some amazing creators. I have Teos Abadia, I have Sersa Victory, and I have C. Stephen Ross, and they are talking about competitive Dungeons and Dragons. That's right, competitive play. We cover everything from table to table, player versus player, player versus GM. It was a really good conversation. If this style of play isn't for you or you've never checked it out, I still recommend listening to this podcast because they bring a lot of great perspective to this and talk about how to approach it and how to approach it if you're new and why it might still be fun. So let's check it out. Here is my interview with them. All right, everybody. Now I am here with three great game designers, all who have worked on some competitive games, all of who can talk about competitive D&D in all of its various and sundry forms. And I'm super excited to have this conversation. But before we get down to it, let's go around the table, tell people who you are and what you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games. Teos, let's start with you.
Hi, folks. I'm Teos Abadia. It's a pleasure to be here with this cool crew. I have worked on a number of competitive events, as well as collaborative large events with lots of different tables playing together. And the competitive events I'm probably known for are the D&D Open, which I helped to bring back 2 years ago in a new incarnation. And then multi-table events such as an Ashes of Athos Dark Sun Interactive, the Vault of the Dracolich that brought multi-table play to stores, and Confrontation at Candlekeep, which started off 5th edition with interactive play at Gen Con.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you back, dude. I'm excited to pick your brain about some competitive D&D. Also with us is Sersa. Sersa, you recommended this topic. I think it's an awesome one, and we've been talking about it for months, and we finally got it going. So tell the people who you are and what you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games.
Yeah, I'm Sersa Victory. I am a writer for Kobold Press, specializing in tournament and convention dungeon delves.
And if you have checked out The Tomb of Mercy, that is a Sersa Victory creation. It's a pretty awesome Death Trap dungeon. And also with us, of course, returning is Ross. Ross, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
Yeah, hey, so I guess my credits in design that are most applicable to this discussion is I designed and ran for a number of years 4th Core Team Deathmatch, and also designed the 5th edition version of that. I did the conversion of Fortress of the Mage, which is a dungeon delving head-to-head competitive game, and I converted that to 5th edition from its original form that Dr. Davy Jones created. I've put out not D&D, but an RPG called Crush the Rebellion, which is competitive. And in a couple of days, I'm going to be putting out a competitive mega game called Aegon's Conquest.
That's really, really cool. We have a team of very prolific people here, too, today. The body of work that the three of you manage to put out all the time is pretty incredible. So I am excited to jump in and talk with you all about competitive D&D. And, a lot of people see D&D as like a cooperative storytelling game, but we know that that's not the only way to play it. In fact, we know that sort of one of the core tenets of D&D is it's for anybody, and you can play it any way you want. And that's part of the beauty of the game, which is why I've asked you all to come on and talk about it. I remember I heard Ross, and I also heard you, Sersa, a few years ago before I was podcasting on a Gen Con panel that I think somebody else the Tome Show had recorded the podcast and played it. And I was like, these guys are blowing my mind right now, because you were talking about Fourth Core and Team Deathmatch, and I was like, I never thought about playing D&D this way, and it sounds really, really awesome and really fun. And then we did play some Fourth Core Team Deathmatch with my friends, and it was really fun.
That's super exciting for me because like I never hear of anyone ever playing it.
Really?
Besides the like events I'm personally at, so I'm like, oh wow, that's awesome. People actually play that, yeah.
Yeah, we all got together and we like had a weekend of games, and it was the last thing we did, and it was amazing. Like it was amazing, and it was like we should have been playing this all weekend. Like that was kind of how.
Do you remember any details about any of the maps that you played?
Yeah, one was a big ship, right?
Oh yeah. Benoit made that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was really, really cool. So that's one reason I'm excited to talk to you about it. So, Sersa, why don't we start with you? You had the sort of the idea of talking about this, and I've had you on podcasts, and you've said things like, well, why can't we just go through the monster manual and have every creature in alphabetical order and rooms in it, right? Why can't we do it? And I'm like, you're right. Why can't we do that? This is a fantasy role-playing game. We can do whatever we want. So for you, what makes competitive D&D awesome? And sort of, if you could also take me through some of the different genres of competitive D&D, because there's a lot of different ways you can slice it.
Yeah, so to answer the first question, what makes it awesome? I don't know, competition is fun. Mm-hmm. It's exciting, it's exhilarating, it gives you an opportunity to, I don't know, trash talk in the nicest sense of the term. I don't know, for me, competition adds a layer of excitement to the game that I find really, really energizing, right? As far as the different kinds of competitive D&D, the one that I'm most familiar with and the one that I run the most and write the most, I guess would be like players versus environment, where the dungeon master primarily plays the role of referee, right? And I know we'll talk a lot tonight about the idea of DM versus players and what that means and what that doesn't mean. But I've always conceived of the dungeon master as a referee. I know there are some people who liken it to the AI in video games, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Where you're not really competing, but you're sort of you're playing your best. And I feel like D&D is a pretty good game for that because it's got a really robust kind of war game set of rules, you know? And I think we'll probably also talk about D&D's war game roots. That was one of the reasons why I got drawn into 4th edition primarily, was because it was a really fun tactical skirmish game with these role-playing elements on top of it. But I've also done things like party versus party, right? So you might have more than one group playing the same dungeon at the same time, and they may interact directly in real time, or it may be a situation where there's a indirect interaction where things happen that affect the global state of all the tables, or you may be playing at different times. You might have one group playing at 1 o'clock, the next group at 4 o'clock, and then you get everybody together at the end of the night. And then, of course, with things like Fourth Core Team Deathmatch, player versus player, which I don't have a tremendous amount of experience with, so I'll totally defer to Ross on that one.
Yeah, so Ross, let's turn to you now. What makes it awesome? What makes competitive D&D great? And what is PvP like? You know, like in its truest form. You know, I think we've got a good sense of working like a referee when a DM has like player versus environment. So what is PvP like?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of things that make competitive tabletop gaming, competitive D&D, however you want to call it, really amazing and really awesome, and something that I just enjoy the hell out of. But one of the things that comes to mind that really is like the crown jewel in it is there's a feeling of camaraderie through shared suffering. And by what I mean by that is that not all, but a lot of these examples that we've been talking about, especially like the D&D Deathmatch and Fortress of the Ur Mage, this is a group, like a D&D group. It's a group of people. It's generally your friends who are all getting together, and you're going out and you're defeating another group. So it's why people get hyped up about sports. It's your home team that's all getting together, and you're going through this shared suffering, this trial, and you're winning together as a team, and you're relying on each other, and the group is more powerful, more together, and more cohesive than the sum of the parts. And that's a special kind of feeling. And when you of course get some of that in a traditional dungeon, a traditional D&D kind of experience, but when it's against a competing group and you have a level playing field that all of your decisions are making a major impact, you can see the effect in the eyes and the reactions of the faces of your competitors. It's a magical feeling,
Yeah, you're right. It's, for most of us, a very different sort of way to play, but you're right. That is it's a way to build camaraderie that I think feels very real because the competition aspect of it is so real, which is cool.
And so with player versus player, which is what you were asking about, part of the challenge there from a DM side is your role is actually a little bit more hands off. And so you during the actual event, and so you have to kind of take a step back, and you're really just there to adjudicate what you've previously already created. You create a level, fun playing field for the two teams or more teams to interact with. It's a little bit nerve-wracking because you have your own creation, and you just kind of like send it out there onto the table and let everyone play around in it. And if there's some sort of problem that happens mid-game, for most of the time, you really just have to let that ride, even though it might be technically a worse design decision, because one of the challenges here with player versus player is that you have to be completely fair to everyone involved. So in a traditional D&D game, if something's going wrong, let's say you have too many monsters or not enough or whatever it is, you can adjust on the fly. And most DMs who have been playing for a little while, they get some experience under their belt. They get kind of an intuitive knack on how to adjust things on the fly and keep the game moving and fun. With players versus player, you don't have the opportunity to adjust on the fly. You don't have the opportunity to kind of make those last-minute tweaks, because if you do, you could inadvertently be totally screwing over someone else's strategy. And so you have to play test a lot more, and you have to really trust in your system and your playing field, in your arena, that is going to just have to work itself out on its own.
Yeah, that's really true. I never thought about it that way, but that's totally, totally true. Teos, how about you? What makes competitive D&D fun for you? Because I think you've got sort of the broad convention view of table versus table kind of style of play.
So if you look back at the earliest adventures for Dungeons & Dragons, there are all these competitive tournaments, whether it's Tomb of Horrors, the Slaver series, Temple of Elemental Evil, the Drow series, the Giants, White Plume. All of these were originally a competitive tournament that showed up at a convention like Gen Con or Origins way back in the day. And what was amazing about those events is they were rough. They weren't the polished form of an adventure that you expect, because when you're running these sorts of tournaments, when you're creating them, you're not playing by the typical rules, or at least you don't have to. And you are deliberately pressuring the players. And so what happens is you get that feeling that Ross was talking about, where as a player, you sit down and you feel a little anxious. Your blood is going a little faster. Your heart rate speeds up, because anything goes here. And unlike that typical experience where your DM might say, hey, let's adjust it this way, a couple of monsters run off. No, here it's going to be the way that it was written. And it might not be particularly fair, or you might make a big fatal mistake. And that creates real excitement, this real sense of you can die. Now, obviously, in player versus player, you're going to die, and there's usually some sort of recovery mechanism. But that sense of excitement that this can really go down poorly, I've seen it time and time again over the years, where people are standing up and they are, it's like they're going to battle, right? They have that feeling. I'm taking my character and I may not come back with it. This is exciting. And I'm going to see things I wouldn't normally see.
That's so interesting that you mentioned like people standing up. Whenever I run deathmatch, like Like that's the first thing everyone does is just like move all the chairs out. They're like, we're not going to need these. Forget it, because you're just like so amped up, and you just want to see that other guy go down, and you want to see your crew succeed. It's just too much.
Influence-wise, we have these classic adventures that are the tournament side of things, but I think a big influence is also video games, right? The experience of something like Doom or Quake, right? Those classic experiences of going through this dungeon kind of as fast as you can and knowing that other people are gunning for you. And, I think if you were a video gamer and you first tried those games, you're like, I'm not sure I want to do this. And then you start playing, you're like, wow, this is really fun.
Yeah, I was going to add to Ross's point. That was one of the first things that I noticed when I first started doing like competitive death trap dungeon player versus environment stuff, was just the level of fear, right? Physical anxiety, but also people. I never saw people stand up and cheer for dice rolls. I'd been playing D&D since I was in middle school, and it was always fun, and it always, you're spending time with your friends and you're telling fantastic stories, and that's all great. But it wasn't until I started doing these kind of, you're being timed, you're being scored, and just the level of excitement and drama around it. It's kind of a rush, honestly. And I've had people, who had never experienced these kinds of things come up and tell me, like, I don't know if I could play regular D&D anymore. This has changed me. Like, I know, right? It's awesome.
It's interesting because, Teos, you mentioned Tomb of Horrors and White Plume and Tomo-chan, and I think like those are also when you play them at home, not as part of a greater competition, they also are sort of player versus environment adventures, right? Tomb of Horrors definitely feels that way. It's really interesting to see sort of how they all kind of go with one another as well, that there are elements of each in all the competitive play across the boards. Now, I think there's probably, this idea of like, how does the competition work? I think people are like, what am I being judged on? Am I being judged on my role playing? Am I being judged on if I survive? Am I getting points in some way? And I think the answer is it could be anything, right? It depends on how the competition is set up. So sometimes the point is just to make it to the end and see if you can live through this very hard experience that has been created. And sometimes it's, hey, you're gaining points based on sort of some objectives that you can reach. A lot of times I have seen people are not judged on things like role playing, for instance, because that's really subjective. And if you have a really nice referee, then it is super, super easy to rack up points that way, as opposed to somebody who expects you to be, like Michael Caine, if you want to win any points role playing. So usually there are things that can be quantified in some way. Did you do X, Y, or Z? Did you do it in this way, or did you do it in this way? But that brings me to this point, which is, when you sit down to design something like this, how do you decide what the win conditions are? Because it feels like, to me, that would kind of be the first thing I would think of, and then I would design backwards from there. And maybe I'm wrong. Is that what you would do, Sersa? You've made a bunch of these. Do you start with the win condition and then work backwards? How do you do it?
So I actually start with the adventure first. So the scoring system and the criteria by which you score people is usually the last thing that I do. It's kind of straightforward because I do pretty traditional death trap dungeon runs, right? So you're 100% correct. And actually, one of the earliest pieces of advice, I remember I was participating at the Advanced D&D Open at like GaryCon or something about 1,000 years ago. And I was asking, like, how do I score people? What am I supposed to do? And the organizer was like, don't worry about role playing. Like, you can't really judge role playing in an objective way. It's a time waster because most of these events are timed, and you don't want to punish a group for, giving a monologue. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a very board game like experience where you're focused on, I don't know what you would call it, those other pillars, right? Exploration and combat. So to give you an example, I just wrapped up a competitive Dungeons and Dragons bar crawl. I am still a little hungover from it. It was on Sunday. And we had three groups playing. It was the same adventure, and they were competing from different bars. What happened was I wrote the module first, but it was a pretty traditional dungeon crush module. So there's treasure, there's monsters, there's secrets, and there's like waypoints, right? Mm-hmm. And what I usually do is I go back and I tally up, okay, here's all the treasures that are in the adventure, here are all the secrets, here are all the monsters, and here are all the points of interest. And then I just assign them point values, and then kind of like a school teacher, I go, okay, 90%'s an A, 80%'s a B. But I never start with the scoring system first. I usually design the dungeon first, and then I look back at the objective things that the players can accomplish, and then I just sort of feel out some points. It's very non-scientific, and at the risk of bogarting too much time, I think that's really important to communicate to people, is that these are not high-stakes things. You know, we're not $1 million salaries aren't on the line. Much to my sadness, I have never heard someone come to me and say, if I don't win the D&D tournament, they're going to sell my grandma's house. Like, you know, we're playing mostly for fun, you know? And so in the 10 years or something I've been doing scored dungeon delves, I've never had somebody get really nitpicky about, you know, well, if they found the Rod of Wonder, that should have been 100 points and not 50 points. I will say one last thing on this is that it's really important to make the scoring system as crystal clear as possible. Yeah. One of the things that I remember, I want to say it was like Doomkeep or one of those like real old school competition modules. The scoring system was kind of obtuse. And I feel like if you make the scoring system complicated for the GMs, particularly if they're seeing the scoring system for the first time about 10 minutes before the game starts, any ambiguity can result in that inconsistency. And as Ross pointed out, you know, that inconsistency is kind of the bane of competitive D&D. So as much as you can in a human moderated competition, minimize that inconsistency. And the way that I found to do that is just make the scoring really crystal clear.
That's a very, very good point. And it's also, you know, your point about having fun, I think, is a really good one, right? It's the same stakes as when you play D&D as more of a collaborative storytelling thing, right? The stakes are the same. You're getting together with friends for a few hours and you're having good fun. It's the same stakes as when you get together to play Settlers of Catan.
Yeah, exactly right. The worst that's going to happen at the D&D tournament is that you're going to have a good time.
Right, exactly. Which makes me want to throw it over to you, Teos, because you've designed these for you know, larger conventions and stuff. And at the D&D Open, can be more than 300 people playing these things at once. So when you think about scoring and when you think about sort of designing these things, what do you keep in mind?
So it depends on the event, but with the D&D Open, the really interesting thing there is that historically it was pretty hardcore and cutthroat, and it became sort of increasingly so over the years, which is a little strange given that, you know, we began this whole hobby as wargamers, and yet it kind of got more cutthroat towards the end. And I think around 4th edition, it really was, you know, number of hit points of damage inflicted, number of hit points you took, how many times you went down, how many times, you know, how many monsters you weren't able to kill. And what that created was a feeling of, it really was so number crunching based that the more you were very good at optimizing, and it was pre-gen characters, but still the more you could milk out of these things and the more of an expert player you were, the more you could win. And that made sense in terms of winning D&D. But where it fell short was on the experience for the majority of players, and particularly casual players. And so as Mike Mearls began to re-envision the D&D Open, bringing it back, what he really thought was, I want to increase its appeal to where anybody has a great time playing this. And that was the biggest overarching goal in redoing the D&D Open, was anybody should have fun. In the first year, we had a table that, and this was 2 years ago, we had a table that died something like 27 times. I'm talking TPKs. That was far more than any other table. And I talked to one of the folks there. I was like, did you have fun? And they said, we had a great time. And that was, so that all the design was, you know, really pointing in that direction, that it should be great. no matter how well you do. And so what we did is we created unlocks. So one of the kind of reward system of unlocks. So for example, the first person to roll a 1 on a saving throw received a certificate. And this was valid for Adventurers League play. So you just got something out of this event for, a boo-boo. The first TPK, the first player to get a long rest got something like, we're so sleepy or something like that. And so you get these sort of certificate awards out, and then kind of the collective group there, all these tables sort of realize, what, we're going to have fun no matter what. Now, some groups, they're in it to win, and they're trying hard to win. And so there are systems in there to reward that as well. But with the D&D Open, we actually did the reverse of what you folks have correctly advised. In most of these kinds of things, you want a very transparent, crystal clear scoring system. With the D&D Open, it's a lot more wishy-washy. And if you look at the scoring system for the old adventure Tomoakan, it's a lot more like that, where if you decided to talk to a certain thing, that might get you points. If you fight with the giant crab, that might lose points. If you cover yourself in slime and, work through the stuck tunnels or something, any number of weird things could get you points, including role-playing. And so there is a number of points that you had for role-playing a little, a medium amount, or a lot. Because, that's points that you can get, and we figured DMs can make a fairly educated, good enough for us evaluation of whether they did a little, a lot, or medium amount of role playing. So that's the kind of approach we took for the D&D Open, but we change it every year. And James, you were responsible for the last D&D Open, this year's, which was a completely different approach to D&D Opens, and was a spectacular success by being a crime heist with a lot of open, imaginative, creative play. So there are a lot of ways you can design these things.
Don't go anywhere. There's more Tabletop Babble coming up. Hey everybody, I wanted to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by audibletrial.com/DSPN. That's right. When you go to audibletrial.com/DSPN, you get 1 free month of Audible's amazing audiobook service and a free audiobook download of your choice. I recommend checking out the great Mike Shea's Fantastic Locations. That's right. Sly Flourish's Fantastic Locations, narrated by our own amazing Rudy Basso. So go check it out at audibletrial.com/DSPN for your free month trial and a free audiobook of your choice. All right, back to the show. Ross, for you, how do you begin your design process? What do you start with first?
I tend to, for my games, start with what the end goal is, or at least what the scoring criteria is going to be for something competitive. So as an example, going back to D&D Deathmatch, this is something that I definitely wanted to be the scoring was how many times you kill the other guys, right? How many times you kill the other team. So we started with that, and I wanted to get that feel of, like we were talking about with Doom and Quake and all those kind of classic first-person shooter deathmatch games, is that how do we then, we have this idea that we want to have a huge number of deaths, and that's how you judge the players, and how do you encourage that and set up a scenario where that's going to happen a lot, and it's going to happen in a fun way, and it's going to happen in a way that really rewards people who have put in both strategy and tactics into their decisions there, that their decisions at the game and in building their characters makes a meaningful impact. And then as another example, when I did Crush the Rebellion, this is basically like a sci-fi storytelling kind of game, but it's definitely competitive. So it's a group of competing, hyper-powerful science fiction agents who are all trying to build their own secret agendas, and some of them are super weapons or destabilizing regimes or whatever it is. So they all have these. So I wanted to have it where you had every player had their own step-by-step process where they're getting to this end goal, and they're all kind of like telling this behind-the-scenes story, but only the player who gets to it first is the one who wins. So all the other players need to have ways, some sort of mechanism to hinder that or to get themselves advanced faster. So that they had a coherent strategy and tactics to that. So then the mechanics just got built around that. Is that, okay, well, how do I create these tools for the players to use to affect the end goal?
That's a really cool way to think about it and to design things, and it's so interesting to think about this. And Sersa, I didn't really get to ask you about this, so I'm interested to get your take about like, what do you think makes for fun? And Ross, I definitely want your take on this too. Like, we talked about why they're awesome, but how do you design for fun? That's really what it is. When you're sitting down and you're like, okay, I want to make this thing. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about Death Trap dungeons. Like, it feels like there's a balance between like, how do I make this fun versus so that it's not just player getting crushed over and over and over again and never achieving anything, right? So how do you make it fun?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would say, and this is crucially important, is that if your module, if your dungeon is not fun to lose, it is not fun, period.
Oh, nice.
You have failed as a designer, and I really love, Teos, what you said about creating these unlocks, these achievements. That was something that I've had a lot of success with as well. You really have to pay close attention. And we talked about this a little bit in that Death Trap Dungeon episode where, in the case of player versus environment, it's got to be cool when you die. It can't just be like you were struck by a dart for 1 dice 4 damage and that's it. Like, it really needs to be a crash and burn scenario. I'm always reminded of a charity event that Brian Patterson of D20 Monkey ran a long time ago with my old module Crucible of the Gods, where basically every time someone died, we gave money to Extra Life. And if there was a total party kill, then like it was like a jackpot scenario where a bunch of money went to Extra Life. And I remember that he had made the comment about halfway through that they had gotten a total party kill and everybody cheered as if that was sort of like the end result. The way that you do that, again, is you make things kind of exciting and spectacular and over the top. As far as like how to create something that's fun and engaging while being competitive, I'm pretty, formulaic in the way that I approach designing stuff for D&D. I kind of look to things like video games and more traditional like tabletop game design and taking those sorts of principles. So one of the things that I've been doing over the past year or so is just reading as many game design books as I can and collating a list of the interesting kinds of decisions. Because in my mind, competition is all about making the right decision at the right time. You are making decisions, but your time is limited, or your resources are limited, right? Or your information is limited. And so where I think competition happens and where it's fun for me and where I try to get to as a designer is constantly and relentlessly putting players in a position where they have to make difficult decisions with limited time, limited information, and limited resources and a little bit of luck, and then just making it really kind of like over the top and explosive.
And I when I think of Crucible of the Gods or Fane, Revenge of the Iron Lich, like those were all really good at creating a sort of crucible feeling, right? That you've been drawn into the crucible, and this is this big moment where you're going to make this big decision. Anything goes. Super exciting. I mean, just great. And all of it spoke to sort of the past of the game, right? Very old school feel to it. Very traditional kind of challenges there, death trap elements that just really got players excited.
Yeah, and I think that's really important too, is I try to avoid premises for these kinds of competitive games that are just like protect the caravan from goblins, or some old wizard in a tower needs you to go like deliver a subpoena to somebody. Like, I don't know. For me, it's always about like it's apocalyptic in scale, because again, like even the marketing materials, I really like what Kobold Press did with Tomb of Mercy, where they really lean. I was kind of surprised, honestly, but they were just like the entire fate of all of our campaign setting that we spent $1 million developing, it could all be washed away if you screw this up. And I was so happy about that. And I think that, that leads, again, competition is all about stakes. If there's nothing, if you don't ante anything, then the excitement's pretty low. I'm glad that had that effect.
Yeah, and I would totally echo those exact words in those comments, is that, the thing that makes it so much fun, or one of the things is that everyone has meaningful impact in the game. what you do and that decision that you make when it's really crunch time, it's so absolutely important. And you can see the effects and you can see it immediately, and the effects are profound throughout the rest of your experience. And if your experience is just, okay, for the next hour or so while we're playing, that's usually how it is. Or it could be more like Tomb of Mercy, where you say, well, this could affect the entire campaign.
Well, one of my favorite stories to tell, I don't think I've ever told this to anybody. Maybe I talked about it to Ross. When I had Crown of Charon, the manuscript, the original one, I turned it into the editor, which was different from DDE Adventures. And the boss has a power where in the power text it says, if a player is killed by this power, the 13th age comes to an end.
That's awesome.
And the editor was like, you need to take that out. That's a little ridiculous. And I said, no.
That's awesome. This sort of brings me to my next thing, which is about these events feel like big must-go-to events when they happen at conventions or if you're playing them with friends. There is something very special about them, and I think part of it is they take a long time to design. But then the other part of it is, in general, when you're playing in a competition style like this, sometimes you're not going to play that character again. I shouldn't say in general, because there are times where you definitely are going to play the character again. But sometimes you're not going to play the character again. Sometimes you're not going to revisit this story, so you do have the chance to do these ridiculous over-the-top things, right? Tomb of Mercy has this very important ticking clock into it. And, we talked about, Sersa, you said that the character deaths need to be dramatic. And I see when people think that the only chance to roleplay is social interaction, I'm like, I don't think that's right. I think that there are chances to roleplay when you're dying. There are chances to roleplay when you are exploring stuff, when you're fighting. Like, you still can be a fun character, scratch that acting itch while you're doing these things. So I guess my question is, why are these good things for companies? Teos, this was your question, and I want to throw it out to you first. Like, why is this a good thing for a company to do? Because obviously you all get paid by companies to make these competitive style modules.
They draw big audiences, and they draw big audiences not just at the conventions, but they draw attention to the conventions and the presence of these companies at the conventions. So for Wizards of the Coast, not only do you fill a very large room with players for the D&D Open, but people hear about it for weeks and months, both before and after the event, if not kind of from there on out. We're still talking about some of the old competitive tournaments that took place back in the early days with Classic Adventures. So it may be that we just continuously talk about these events because they stick around. And because the situations are far more memorable, then it's something that ends up being part of the talk amongst players for many years to come.
Right, like it's the reason why you go to big gaming events, big conventions and whatnot, like for at least for some people, because if you have a regular group, you can play canned modules all day, every day for weeks on end, but you can only do competition with a large number of other D&D players from outside your close gaming circle.
Yeah. And just to give an example of something that really caught people's imagination, when we ran Confrontation at Candlekeep, all these tables are running around, and you would run it in a pod of 6 or 7 tables with one kind of a master librarian would kind of head the group, and there'd be several of these pods throughout the convention area. And at one of the pods, a player, when this dragon swept across their tower and fought them briefly and then headed on, the player said, "Can my character jump onto the back of the dragon?" And so this person runs over and asks me, can that happen? I'm like, absolutely, it can happen. So suddenly that character goes, and the player goes to the other table following this dragon, and now is fighting at another group at their table, joining in. And it was so cool for everybody there that we quickly passed word out to all of the different head librarians saying, hey, if people at your table come up with this idea, go for it. And we eventually wrote it into part of the event that we'd say to everybody running the event, hey, this is a thing that people often want to do. And we saw it a lot. I mean, it was just a thing that people were, I want to keep fighting this dragon. Can I jump on its back? Can I grab its tail? And so we'd say, hey, come up with a fun mechanic, improvise, do whatever you want. This is sweet. And so we had, characters. I remember one halfling in particular that was so proud to jump for this dragon, missed the opportunity to catch the edge of the tower, and just plunged to their doom. And they're probably still talking about how much fun that was.
Still telling that story, right?
Well, that's part of the spectacle, One of the things similar to that that we've been doing here in Bloomington, becoming a tradition, is our head-to-head Dark Souls dungeon delve. Mm-hmm. And we had similar sort of ways to interact with other tables. And I imagine most people listening to this know a little bit about how Dark Souls works. You could send invading phantoms to other tables. And just the spectacle of a GM running to another table and just shouting like, invaded by a greater cleric phantom. And it was great because there was these partitions, so you couldn't really hear like the table talk. But the moment of you watch your GM like run behind a partition, and there's that moment of pregnant pause, and then like a second later you just hear wailing and just anger and frustration. That draws people in. I mean, I got my start at Gen Con doing Tower of Gygax, which was a crazy sort of meat grindy kind of thing. And one of the things that was most intoxicating about it was the fact that people were spectating. And I remember at its height, like 2009, 2010, we no joke had 50 people standing around a table of probably 6 players. And that's just not something that, you see with any sort of traditional, D&D adventure. And so again, like I think that's what draws people in, because it's something you can point to. It makes for great photography.
It is so spectacularly fun to fight another character because you often aren't allowed to do it. And I recall in the Living Greyhawk years, there was a convention that was running just a normal adventure, but in the adventure, this bad guy could possess a character. And that forced a fight between that character and the rest of the party. And there was some guidance in the adventure as to how to choose that person. And I remember there was a special table going on one side, which was this like one-shot special mission thing. It was supposed to be the most exciting ever. And then next to it was this table running this adventure. And this guy who was a monk and very capable at it gets taken over by the spirit. And he just stands up and he yells at the rest of his party, "I'm taking all of you guys down." And the whole room comes over to watch as this guy begins to, in fact, single-handedly take down his party. And it ended up him and like an arcane trickster, like just trading blows, and he still ended up winning, right? And I mean, just the room cheered. It was like so much fun to see just in a regular adventure, characters being able to take each other on, and they all had a blast.
Yeah, that's definitely something. I think that's something that sometimes people, when they hear that there's a player versus player scenario in any kind of form, they instinctively react poorly to that. They say, "Oh no, that's not bad," because a lot of players, in growing up with D&D and playing, especially when we were younger and didn't know better, we try out all sorts of different stuff. And sure, we try out, the evil campaign and let's see what happens when the players in the group fight each other. But they would run into problems like, well, now we got to play with each other next week. So what do we do then? And they didn't, a lot of people don't understand that when we're talking about these competitive games, it's like a one shot kind of thing. You're not going to keep doing the same thing with the same group of people every time you see them. It's like, okay, we have this one chance to try something crazy out. Let's go nuts.
In Gary Gygax's games, you'd hear about how he would run a single player through Castle Greyhawk or some other storied dungeon just kind of whenever. And so what might happen is you show up to play and you realize that level of the dungeon got cleared out by another player the previous week. You're like, oh man, Robilar beat me at this? Seriously? I wanted that loot. I wanted to sack this level of the dungeon. Now it's, I got to go to another level because it's been taken out by another character.
The important thing to keep in mind with all the stuff we're talking about is the social contract and the social context. So to Ross's point, I think people rightly have a pretty allergic reaction when they hear player versus player, because what that conjures up for them are memories of people just being antisocial at the table.
Yes.
And they're acting in bad faith, and they're just kind of causing problems for other people. Whereas when we talk about stuff like fourth core team deathmatch or the open or things like that, or like, sending invading phantoms to other tables, that's part of the context and the contract. Like, we're all here to do that. We're all doing this in good fun. It's sort of baked into the event. And so I think if people have kind of bad experiences with player versus player stuff, I invite them to try out something like the open or a competitive module, because it's a totally different thing than what we're talking about.
The social contract is a big thing, and going into it with a clear idea of this is how it's going to be, as opposed to being 13 and somebody being a bully because they want your magic items killing you, is a very different thing. And it sort of brings me to, I do want to touch on this just briefly. There was a CNBC interview with Jim Cramer and Brian Goldner, the president and CEO of Hasbro, where he made an offhand comment about D&D being ripe for esports. I think that was actually in reference to, they were talking about a suite of video games for D&D before that. So I think it was actually in reference to that. But this idea started to get floated on the internet of like, what would it look like if there was competitive D&D tournaments that were streamed, right? And I think we've already seen some during the Tomb of Annihilation the Stream of Annihilation. They had Chris Perkins ran a meat grinder game, right, where he tried to kill as many characters as possible. Like those were the stakes. Everybody knew it going in. And you got to watch him tear up Joe Manganiello's character sheet and grin ear to ear as he was doing it. So like I don't know. I had a ton of fun watching that. I think that there's like potential to watch these things that you all are designing as streams. People are already doing it, and I think it actually is a really, really fun thing. Sersa, you have streamed before, right? Stuff that you've done.
Yeah, very rarely. I personally am not much of a stream watcher or a stream doer. I'm kind of off my own little world. But we've done things like Crucible of the Odds, which was that charity game that I mentioned before. Occasionally we've done other similar charity events. But I might punt on that question because I'm kind of not really much of a streamer.
No, that's okay. And I think that's a thing that I think makes a lot of sense. Doing it for charity, I do think it makes it more of an event, especially with the win conditions that you described.
Yeah, and I do like, I mean, I've seen bits and pieces of streams where they have things like if the audience makes a particular donation, something bad happens to the, or something good. And actually, I really like that. I like extending those difficult decisions out to the audience, and I think that's again part of the spectacle and part of the draw is that it's something novel, right? Like you have no idea what's going to happen, and I'm a big fan of like metagame stuff. Without spoiling too much or taking up too much time, one of the items I just finished writing for my next Kobold Press adventure lets you steal items from other tables running a dungeon delve completely unrelated to what you're doing. Like you hand a letter to GM and it's like, I'm running a game over here and these idiots decided to open up this book. Please write down the name of a magic item and a treasure. Give this back to me. By the way, here's a drink ticket. And and you're just like, oh my God, like, you don't expect to see that. And that's fun.
That's amazing. Yeah, well, in that, the One Shot Network, James D'Amato did this stream called Dungeon Dome, and essentially it was like fantasy pro wrestling. People built D&D characters that would return week after week, but then they would show up in this arena and they would, battle, and then there were like sort of these, pro wrestling style stories that were going on around the battle and stuff. And he had like item drops that would, chests would drop in and stuff like that. So it does remind me of that when the audience gets involved. Ross, you, in your notes here to me, not only have you mentioned stuff you worked on, you said there's actually a LARP? Oh,
yeah. So this is something that Luke Crane of Burning Wheel fame had put out, I want to say this past fall, maybe. Not too long ago. It's called Inheritance, and it's technically a LARP, and it is absolutely competitive. So this is Basically, this is the story of I believe, 11th century, some sort of Icelandic or Norwegian family whose patriarch has died, and they come all together, traveling to a single household to read the will, honor grandfather, and divide up his inheritance. But each of these characters, and they all have backstories prepared for you and told to you, has conflicting viewpoints as to what they think the other people are up to, and they all have conflicting goals and desires. And there is a very limited but fair and clear hierarchy and mechanics as to what does happen when one person tries to harm the others, which they will, either through might of arms, or there's poisonings, and there's all sorts of things like that. And I've run the game twice now, and I've seen it run a couple times, and it's always just you start with 9 players, which is kind of onerous to get 9 players, but you start with 9 players, and it ends in just like a massive bloodbath, and it's amazing.
Wow.
Because all of a sudden people start piecing together like, oh, okay, based on what this person said, I think what their goal is really trying to do is X, and then the players are able to then start making alliances with others, start plotting, and start creating a coherent strategy to get what they really want out of it. Because medieval inheritance is it's messy. Like who inherits when when grandfather dies? Okay, his son gets inheritance under medieval law. But what happens if that person's dead? And then what happens if all the men are dead? And then it gets crazy.
Wow, that's just really awesome. But have you ever streamed any sort of competitive stuff that you've done?
I've tried a number of times to do something with Fourth Core Team Deathmatch in the past, but the biggest hurdle was honestly just technical. Just having the kind of equipment that would allow that kind of projection. I just didn't have I'm not a regular podcaster or streamer or anything like that, so it was kind of like a big investment to get cameras and multiple of them to get different angles, especially because it's kind of a crowded viewpoint just for one event. So, if Hasbro's serious about esports on D&D, they are welcome to come to me and I can run it for them, and that would be great.
Excellent. Well, I know Brian Goldner loves this podcast. It's his favorite. So,
yeah, Brian, give me a call, bro. Give me a call.
He's a smart guy.
And Teos, I think you've got some ideas too about D&D sort of esports as well, as far as how streaming could be done for this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think with esports, the more that you really want to make it feel like an esports, right, where it feels like there are maybe leagues, teams, fans can come together around those groups. There are a number of interesting ways to do that, or you could back off and do it a little lighter than that. But if you really want to go down the esports area, you could take something like Dungeons & Dragons has factions. And so you have groups like the Veiled Alliance and the Harpers and the Zentarum. And so you could very easily start seeing like, those can be our teams. Those can be our kind of groups that we rally behind. And we see how they do across the year, and maybe at the end there's some big championship or a number of events that dictate how they do. And we can look to a number of influences, but probably the biggest I'd point to is the Legend of the Five Rings system, both for the role-playing game and the collectible card game. Legend of the Five Rings, you play these different clans that exist in this very Japanese type region. And when you're a member of this and you get into it, the rabbit hole quickly expands, because you can do things where if you show up on one of these forums and say, I'm interested in this, they'll say, oh, I want to sign you up because I'll pay to sign you up for the newsletter because we'll get points.
Oh, wow.
And the points are constantly being measured clan against clan to see who's doing better, right? So they get way into it. Through the way this system is set up. And you could do the same thing with factions, right? Imagine you're playing Adventurers League and you're truly scoring points for the Harpers versus the Zentarum. Or you run some kind of live stream event, and you could even have just a single table, but everybody has a faction goal. And so in addition to this cooperative, normal D&D play that we know, they are jostling to try to accomplish their goal and win more points at it. Or you could have different tables who are all aligned with factions and they're playing against one another. And a lot of that could be very camera friendly, right? If you think of like the Stream of Many Eyes that Wizards did recently, they all had different tables run by different DMs that were playing a linear story on I think it was Saturday or Sunday. They had group after group was sort of continuing the chase for this magic item. Well, what if they're actually competing to find the magic item or get the most points around finding the item, and they're each aligned with a faction, right? That could be very interesting, and at the end, you could certainly crown a winner, and I think it would be a very watchable event.
That's what I'm most excited about. Is I want to see like the Allstate Insurance like critical failure. You know, I want to see Howie Long on a half-hour talk show after the game is over.
I want to see a D20
that's really
roll
what I'm
in slow
interested
motion and hit a 1.
Yeah, with like a robot, and he throws a D20 at the screen, and it explodes into like the Progressive logo, and then you sit for 20 minutes for 15 minutes of gameplay.
That's great.
Guys, this has been an amazing chat, and we could keep it going because I have so many other things I want to talk about. So please come back so that we can maybe do a part 2 of this. I think it would be really, really fun. And Ross, I know you and I are going to talk too about something cool you've got coming. But before we go, let's go around the table, let people know where they can find you. Sersa, where can people find you on the internet?
On Twitter, I am at Sersa_Victory. You'll also see my stuff popping up on the Kobold Press website.
Awesome. And where can people find you, Teos?
You can find me at AlphaStream on Twitter, and my blog is alphastream.org. And of course, my products are on the DMs Guild. Always appreciate people's support.
And they're really fun. You should check them out.
Thanks.
Go buy Adamantine Chef. Speaking of memorable encounters, this is a great game. And Ross, where can people find you?
Yeah, on Twitter, I'm C. Stephen Ross, and you can find most of my work coming out of ddeadventures.wordpress.com. And from there, there's links to where I have things up on DriveThruRPG.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining me today to talk about competitive D&D. This was great. Great discussion. I really love when those gentlemen are on. They're really smart and brilliant and always make me think about the game differently. So extra special thanks to Sersa for bringing this topic forward. You know, everybody, Tabletop Babble is still a new show, and you can help us grow. How? By heading on over to iTunes and leaving us a review. Seriously, it helps other people find the podcast, even if they're listening in different podcatcher apps. It is quite helpful. And if you leave us a 5-star review, I will read it out loud and credit the person who left it. You can make me say anything you want. So please leave us a review. I'm out of them. I don't have any left to read. I've scoured the internet. So yes, if you could leave one, make me say something fun for the fans. You know, people, speaking of new shows, you should definitely check out Total Party Thrill. They just joined the network, although they've been around for over 3 years now as a podcast. Each week, Shane and Ishan take a different look at RPGs and give you advice based on their games. They also build a new level 20 5th edition character around a theme, and they talk about how they created it. They are funny, they are smart, they are amazing. If you like Tabletop Babble, you're going to love Total Party Thrill, so check it out. People, if you're interested in the game design work that I'm doing, head on over to worldbuilderblog.com and follow me on Twitter at James Introcaso for game design thoughts and pictures of my dog, Lilo. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Don't forget that RPGs are like sex. Props can help. Hey everybody, just wanted to let you know that this episode of Tabletop Babble was brought to you by Kobold Press. Kobold Press are the makers of fine 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons products, as well as Pathfinder, 13th Age, and so many other systems. They created the Tome of Beasts, a product you might be familiar with, and the Midgard campaign setting, and the Kobold Guides 2, and Deep Magic, and I could go on because they have an amazing library. But what I want to talk to you about right now is the Warlock Bestiary. The Warlock Patreon from Kobold Press, available at patreon.com/koboldpress, brings you the Warlock Bestiary for 5e. This new volume of a dozen monsters is available to all patrons who pledge $3 or more. It features great black and white art by Russ Nicholson and is gonna have some really, really cool creatures. You are gonna want to check this out. Plus, the Warlock Patreon is the gift that keeps on giving, because there is constantly new 5th edition content coming out. You can get adventures, you can get player options, you can get monsters, magic items, all kinds of awesome stuff. If you want the Warlock Bestiary old school monsters for 5th edition, head on over to patreon.com/koboldpress. That's patreon.com/koboldpress.